From the halls of Austin to the fights in D.C. that hit us at home, this is Politics with the Big Dogs.
Hello, hello, hello. This is Anthony Holm, host of Politics with the Big Dogs. And, folks, we have a huge show for you today. Per the norm, sadly, there's so much content. We'll do our best to get through it all. The radio show is right at 54 minutes. We're, for the rest of the content, assuming it goes over, which I suspect it will, make sure you're going to our podcast because we load up a longer show there. You can go to Spotify, Apple, YouTube, all of the places you find a podcast, Politics with the Big Dogs. Download it and listen to the rest. Let me hit some of these. So, look, Texas keeps us proud, folks. A number of ICE protesters, in fact, members of Antifa, which President Trump, the September of last year, designated Antifa as a terrorist organization. So on July 4th of last year, these guys hit an ICE facility in North Texas. They're protesting it. They bring fireworks. They're trying to get detainees' attention, and they end up having confrontation and start shooting at ICE agents or actually folks who are working at the facility, and the local police show up to stop the terrorism, and I'm using that word deliberately because Antifa members are now a designated terrorist organization. Thank you, President Trump. I'm shocked. I don't know why the Republicans in the Congress didn't do this decades ago, but nonetheless they did. Well, these guys got sentenced. They had a trial. 8 of them were found guilty, and they got sentenced. One of them got 100 years. One of the bullets that was fired hit the police officer, one of the police officers who responded in the local community in the neck. He lived, hallelujah. A number of them got 50 years. So Texas keeping us proud, keeping this nonsense in check. Minnesota should have done this long ago. Another topic, the rise and success of democratic socialists in America. Mamdani, the Muslim Democrat Socialist mayor of New York City, endorsed a number of 2 Democratic challengers to incumbent Democratic U.S. House members and endorsed in an open seat. All of the Democratic Socialists won, so they won the open seat. They defeated the incumbent Democrats for U.S. House. So what does it mean? What are these issues? This is a huge victory for the Democratic Socialists, and frankly, it's going to be helpful to Republicans in November because the contrast is so great. We're doing a look ahead of the Texas legislature and what session means, what we're likely to see. Folks are already gearing up on policy outcomes. Yes, we have elections in November. Some Republicans will lose, so there'll be a little bit more Ds. We're unsure of how many, but traditionally that happens when there's a Republican president, Republican U.S. House, or Republican Senate. I think it'll be much less than all of this fear-mongering, and I'll explain why. We're going to talk about we've got to have time and make sure we get to the U.S. Senate, which 4 Republicans this week joined all the Democrats, and they neutered President Trump while he's negotiating with Iran. We have all of this firepower. We get Iran in a pretty vulnerable spot. He opens up the Strait of Hormuz. Oil is flowing again. And then 4 liberal Republicans, I was really surprised Cornyn wasn't one of them, joined the Democrats and impaired President Trump's ability to negotiate with Iran and resolve it. I'm just so troubled. It's an attack on our nation. It's an attack on patriotism. At least wait until after the negotiations. Thank goodness the DOJ, Trump DOJ, $6.5 billion Medicare fraud alleged, 450 people across America criminally charged, many in California. You've got to hear some of it. I mean, it's just shocking what they were doing. Paying people to go into hospice care so they could get thousands and thousands a month per individual from Medicare and the federal government for hospice care, paying people to be there. It's just Minnesota's, fraudulent daycare 2.0. We've got a far fall on the Rastafarians as a religious faith in prisons. I've got to give you a quick update on that we can go fast. This is just heartbreaking, this next item. Canada. 20 years ago, Canada created effectively a court, and it had a big name, and it was, we're going to end discrimination. This is the court of discrimination. Well, guess what? They fined a scientist $500,000 for saying, a boy is born a boy and a girl is born a girl, and you can't change that. A sex change doesn't change that. Well, they decided that was discrimination. Got to explore it. We've got to talk about this. If we can get to it, the Texas platform. So the delegates, they passed a platform at the convention. I was one of the delegates. I was there. I voted on it. And we got to get into some of the details because it's interesting. Hallelujah. They're out there leading the way on conservative values. And another day, another week, and basically another Texas teacher convicted of sexual assault of a number of children, their students. So a big, big news week. There's more that we're going to hit. We'll get the highlights, at least the big issues, hopefully on the radio show. And some of what I can't get to, go to the podcast. This is Anthony Holm, host of Politics with the Big Dogs. Thank you for joining us. Make sure you're following us. PoliticsWithTheBigDogs.com. We have a weekly newsletter. It's the best way to stay informed. Follow us on social media, but all the podcasts are loaded. Everybody's in there. Download them. Enjoy them. So let's start off with this Canadian shocker. It's so horrific, though. This stuff has happened in the U.S. as well, right? So in Canada, a gentleman who was a school board trustee, I don't know if that's appointed or elected, but a serious actor in the community who is on the Chilliwack Board of Education trustee. His name is Barry Neufeld, a community participant, right? A leader. You guys have heard me over the years say I think it's 10-15% of the people who do virtually all of the same things in society, and the rest of us get a free ride, right? The same people who are on the school board are also leading the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or coaching soccer. They tend to do the same thing. So pitching in for the community. This guy, Barry, is on the local school board. He's a strong conservative, but he's a thoughtful human, self-identified Christian, thoughtful, active in the community, starts questioning some of the local schools, the school district's sexual orientation and gender identity program. Back in October of 2017, Neufeld posted on his own webpage, on his own Facebook page. He says, quote, "At the risk of being labeled a bigoted homophobe, I have to say that I support traditional family values, and I agree with the American College of Pediatricians that allowing little children to choose to change their gender is nothing short of child abuse." Something that I've echoed, something I agree with, something I believe to be right and appropriate. These are my words, right? His ended at child abuse. So Mr. Neufeld had the audacity, quote unquote, tongue in cheek, to say that, I agree with the American College of Pediatricians, and helping a child or encouraging them or even allowing them to change their gender, I think it's child abuse. Well, turns out about 20 years ago, Canada, being the nation it is, that said, hey, we're going to create this tribunal, and it's just for discrimination, and we're going to ensure that no discrimination happens, and we're going to be experts in discrimination, and if you have a claim, you can come before us. So Neufeld wrote the tensions, he said, there's only two sexes, and he actually cited Genesis and said, quote, "So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them," close quote. He went on to the Facebook. He said he felt called to motivate lukewarm Christians who are sitting idly by as all of society slouches toward Gomorrah. And then he said transgender ideology has, quote, "demonized people of faith who believe that God created humans male and female in the light of God," close quote. So here's this board of a trustee who questioned the school's sexual orientation and gender ID, their SOGI, S-O-G-I, program. And then on his private Facebook page, he says, hey, here's what's happening, and I'm really troubled by it. I'm a faith-driven believer, and I happen to believe in science, right? We have two genders. They're born that way. Well, he ends up being sued and has to pay $750,000 US. It was a Canadian value, but it equates to right at $750,000 US, and virtually nobody's covering this. The Christian Broadcasting Network did cover it. There was a blurb in the Wall Street Journal which covered it, but the justification for the $750,000 is the tribunal, Canadian Tribunal, British Columbia, Canada, said, well, we think there's anywhere from 45 to 163 people who were identified LGBTQ working in the school system in the last 5 years, from 2017 to 2022. So each of them needs to be compensated for the offense that they got when you posted this on your private Facebook page. And he's going to have to pay it, right? There's just no way around it. It's wild. And these teachers came and brought the claim. They did it anonymously. There was one called Plaintiff Identified as Teacher C to compensate the former teacher's lost wages for attending a hearing about Newfield's personal views. So they bring suit, and then they have to take a couple days off of school, and then he has to pay for their missing class. He's got to pay him lost wages, in addition to the many thousands of dollars that each are going to receive because he made a Facebook post. This may sound shocking, but it's not, right? Sadly, we're in this weird place in history where folks are just straight up being arrested, being prosecuted for really rational statements on Facebook or the internet. How many times have we talked about the British being pulled out of their homes because they made a statement about radical Islam, and they're being arrested and incarcerated in jails because of quote unquote discrimination. We had it here in the U.S. and many examples of it, right? Colorado being the most conspicuous. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down 8-1 a law that prohibited people in mental health counselors and therapists in Colorado using any words. We've talked about this in some of the previous show. I flagged this for you, from using any words or sentiment or statements that in any way help a client, quote, realign their identity. So if a little boy or a little girl has decided that they're really a member of the opposite sex, and there was a law in Colorado that said a therapist, a counselor, a mental health provider cannot incite or help walk them back or use any language that suggests that they consider returning, quote unquote, returning to their natural birth gender. So shocking, but this happens all the time in Western society. Like, there's this great defense of the LGBTQ, and they're memorializing laws that you can't say there's only two genders, right? And there's this great defense about radical Islamists. Can't go out in England and talk about it. In the U.S. in some instances, yet they're trying to bring Sharia law. They're trying to create their own communities. They're coming to the U.S. and wanting to replace the the values of the U.S., and we're getting in a place and a time in society that if you go and discuss it, you'll be sued and lose thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, or perhaps be criminalized and spend time in jail. These things are real and ripe, and of course the news is not covering them. They're doing the exact opposite. They're not covering all the killings of blacks who are just slaughtering whites in America. They're only covering the ones where a white person causes a black person to die. It may not even be assault and murder. It may be self-defense, but it's be recharacterized, or a straight person defends themselves against a band of LGBTQ, and then that's highlighted. Oh, well, the gay rights activists got hurt. This is what society is just hurtling towards, and because people are not engaging in debate, they're afraid to be canceled, they're afraid to lose their jobs, they're afraid to be criticized. More and more laws and regulations are being implemented in the U.S. and in Western culture to ensure that you can't speak out against this. James Talarico, the Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate, said, oh, of course, science has unequivocally determined there aren't two genders. Indeed, there are 6. Right? Like, this is what's happening in the world. This is I'm following the science during the COVID fraud. This is not a bacteria. You have too much stress. You've got to drink milk and do it. No, it's just a bacteria, and it was knocked down by a simple pill. So we have gone off a shoot on a tangent in Western society that is suppressing speech, and that's one of the reasons that the First Amendment is such a powerful instrument for freedom. Even though Colorado, the radical activist state led by a openly gay governor, tried to suppress speech, the U.S. Supreme Court 8-1 struck it down, right? Of course, a mental health counselor can talk to a 6-year-old little boy who some adults or series of adults in their world have said, oh, but you're really a little girl, aren't you? And has them dressing in a wig and everything else. He says, hey, I just want to play football. Maybe I am a boy. Colorado, you couldn't say, well, that's something to explore. Have you considered living as a boy? Would have been illegal. It was a crime. Holy smokes. So that's what's going on in the world. It's not unique to Canada. It's not unique to what we view as radical activism. It is front and center. We're seeing it at Texas A&M. We're going to go and revisit that here a little bit later in the show, or at least something similar. The so-called DEI ban through Texas public institutions. Of course, it's alive and well. We've talked about it before. We're going to talk about it again.
Love what you're hearing? Find all of our shows at politicswiththebigdogs.com. Subscribe to our newsletter and send in your questions. politicswiththebigdogs.com.
You know, Texas A&M, they gave tenure, which we all thought was already going out of style in Texas, and I actually thought it had been banned. But nonetheless, Texas A&M Board of Regents signed off on a big pile of tenure, so now it's really hard to get rid of any of these professors. And we talked about it on another show here, so make sure if you haven't heard that podcast, go to Apple, go to Spotify, go to YouTube and listen to it. Really tragic DEI activists, LGBTQ activists, and A&M Board of Regents rubber stamped pass. Thank you for our friends at Texas Scorecard who pointed this out. Well, just a quick follow-up to that, because it's kind of in vein with Colorado. It turns out that the A&M system, top to bottom, had reviewed, 6 levels of review about all of these, to include Tommy Williams. Tommy Williams was then the interim president of Texas A&M. He's a former Republican state senator from the Woodlands area. He's been around, kind of a Capitol gadfly that's worked for a bunch of different agents in the Capitol and flexing and trying to advance power. He's also been a lobbyist. So even his office reviewed these. And these were full-on DEI activists who, clear as day, on their A&M websites, putting, specialize and DEI and equity and inclusion and LGBTQ rights, dreadlocks and African garb, the whole thing. So there's no excuse for this. And it is just, again, institutionalized. 7 layers of bureaucracy approved all of these applications. And finally, the poor, all of the Governor Abbott appointed regents rubber stamped them. Of course, Tommy Williams is there because of Governor Abbott as well, and his advocacy in that space. So we've just got to be real with ourselves and with our elected officials and all these leaders who say, oh no, we're against DEI. In fact, we outlawed DEI. Don't worry about that. Years ago we did. Yet it keeps manifesting itself and nobody is doing anything about it because those elected leaders whom we elected, moved on to some other issues, and we too have moved on. We're trying to close the primaries. We're trying to ban taxpayer-funded lobbying. We just assumed that their word was adequate, that DEI has been stamped out. And of course, on other shows, we've looked at the Texas budget, which instructs many of the medical schools in Texas, you shall have 39% non-white students this year and seek for 40 or 41%. I'm kind of doing it ad lib, but that's effectively what it says. And we'll be doing audits and looking at future budgets about how well you succeed here. So we're not running a merit system. We're still running DEI. We're still running racial quotas, even though it's been outlawed in the U.S. It's outlawed in the U.S. Constitution. It has been affirmatively struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. Thank you, Ed Bloom, who also was one of the early guests on this show. Yet it's still rampant in Texas. It's still rampant among the Republicans who have run our state for 3+ decades now. And I did at least want to do a wave at Texas A&M. Let's move on. Let's move on to the rise of socialism in America. What happened this week? Mayor Mamdani, the avowed socialist Muslim mayor of New York City, who we've talked about in the past, no doubt you're aware of, waded into 3 congressional primaries. And all 3 of his socialist activists won this week in New York. They won on Tuesday. 2 of them defeated incumbent Democrat congressmen. I mean, that is just shocking. 98% of every incumbent gets reelected. And 2 challengers to incumbents defeated them, in large part with a Bernie Sanders, Mamdani Democratic Socialist movement. And the third one who won was in an open seat. So 3 U.S. House members, Democrats, no doubt, will be elected in November. They're heavily Democratic-leaning district. And they're going to Congress, and what do they want to do? They want to socialize Medicare, socialize Medicare for all, total social housing, government creating housing, create a trans bill of rights for children and adults. If you want to change your sex, and you have a bill of rights, just like the right to speech and the right to defend yourself, the Second Amendment. So they want to socialize the workplace and give a union bill of rights. Everybody needs to join a union, and you can't be fired. And you're moved to a 4-day work week and not more than 36 hours. They want a basic allotment. So if you don't have a job, you get a check nonetheless. They want to have a super high minimum wage. They call it a living wage, but it's a massive hit. These are radical and crazy notions and just vitiate a free market system. We've talked a lot on the show about the rise of big business versus that of free markets. Texas has gone the other direction from socialism, and not in a good way, frankly. Texas leaders have become the defenders of big business. Big insurance companies, big multinationals come here and will give you protections that the other 30 million Texans do not get. Right? Well, that's not free market. That's a big business. So big business is moving here eagerly, but that's not a free market system. If you're trying to create a mom and pop shop, you struggle in Texas. You're highly regulated, and you have to give deference to all these big business who have protected rights and opportunities well in advance of you. It's not a level playing field, but it's sure not democratic socialism. Hallelujah. In one regard, we should be thankful for it. And here's why we should be thankful. As crazy as it is, I don't want these people in Congress. I don't want these ideas in Congress. But okay, we're going to have a national debate about free markets for socialism. And usually in an environment like this, an electoral environment is what I'm referencing, the party out of power has a wave election. So it is unusual to have a situation that we're in currently. We currently have a Republican president of the United States. We have a Republican-controlled House, even though it's a narrow majority, and we have a Republican-controlled Senate. It's only happened 2 or 3 times in the last 50 years or so, and what it usually leads to is a wave election where the party out of power comes sweeping in from, I think it was roughly 40 U.S. House seats that brought in the Gingrich Revolution way back when, in 96 or so, to the anti-Obama wave, right, when they went and ran the country into the ground and advanced Obamacare and did all these things they said they wouldn't do. Again, part of the old Tepper time, that, moderate Republican Carl Tepper, go along, get along, who says, hey, Anthony's not telling everybody he's a lawyer. Yes, I am. I'm a lawyer, and I do trials. I've also written a book, 52 Reasons Not to Vote for Obama, way back in the day when he was running for re-election. I was all over Fox News and national news programs promoting it and outlining why, and 52 lies that Obama told the electorate, and then he did the exact opposite once he got elected. I could have done 102, but I stopped at 52. It seemed like a reasonable number, one for each week of the year, right? So I give that wave here, and these wave elections occur. Here's why I believe, at least currently, that is not going to occur now. Number one, the Democrats aren't viewed as a reasonable party. They aren't viewed as moderates. They aren't viewed as any of the things that attract swing voters. Instead, they're viewed as Democratic socialists, right? Because those are the folks who are winning. They're viewed as the Talaricos of the world who say, hey, there's really 6 genders. There's not 2. It's scientifically proven, unequivocal. They are viewed as extremists and so far outside of the norm. They're viewed as the party that wants to ensure that men and boys get to compete in girls' and women's sports. They want to ensure that teenage boys get to shower with our daughters in public schools by these trans bill of rights if they wake up and identify as a girl that day, right? That is so far outside of the mainstream that they do not have a favorable opinion among the electorate. And the most important portion of the electorate are the moderate Republicans, the kind of what we call 1Rs, folks who have voted in one of the last 3 or 4 primaries, Republican primaries, and the 1Ds, right? The same thing goes there. And then the folks in the middle who don't and haven't voted in a primary but show up in the November elections. Those are defined as a swing vote. So President Trump's unfavorable ratio is quite high. He's disliked generically. That happens. It's very common. Most of our presidents over the last 25 years have been similarly situated. But what is distinct this election cycle is that Democrats' favorable-unfavorable ratio is even higher than that of President Trump. And it's one of the reasons that, at least as we sit here at the late June, I do not see November wave election occurring. Now, will the D's overperform? Absolutely. In the legislature, what's that mean? I don't know, 4 or 5, maybe 6 Texas House seats. But generally, on a wave election, the Democrats would be picking up 11-ish Texas House seats. I just don't see it happening. Generally, a Talarico, and when I say generally, I mean in a wave election cycle over the last 40 years, somebody like the Democrat nominee for U.S. Senate in Texas would be running much, much stronger than he is. And people are just learning about his craziness. So the most recent polling is like 43-42 Paxton with some undecided. People don't have any opinion of Talarico. They just haven't learned much about him. But he ought to be up by 4 or 5, and he's just not. He should be up by 4 or 5 because of the environment we're in. But the environment is impacted by the ideas, the beliefs, and the values advocated by the Democrats. And they aren't out there talking about lowering property taxes, right? They aren't talking about creating jobs. They aren't talking about improving the schools. They're talking about this radical extreme events. So I share that because I'm much less concerned that we're going to have a big wave election and D's are going to sweep Texas and overperform. It could change. There's a lot of time for public sentiment to change between now and November, or really call it mid-October when people start casting ballots, but it's unlikely. The generic D versus R, like if the election were today, would you vote for the Democrat or Republican, is Democrat plus 6. Okay. It may sound striking, but don't fear that. It usually runs Democrat plus 4 because more people will say that they're going to vote for the Democrat, but then they don't show up. Republicans show up. There are fewer of us, and we show up. So plus 4 equals about the status quo. So right now there's a slight edge for D's in Texas and nationally, but it's just not strong enough. I mean, Karl Rove and others are out there bashing Trump for having such low favorables. They're about the same as George W. Bush's when he was president, maybe a little bit lower. But the biggest distinction is the Democratic Party has higher net negatives than President Trump. And that's why, as we sit here today, do not fear a Democratic wave just wiping everything out in Texas and taking us back to our socialists, right? The more these radical Islamic socialist candidates surge into office and become the face of the Democratic Party, the less and less likely they are to achieve victory in November because they're just becoming and identifying as more and more extreme and more radical. So Mamdani had a big night. The Democratic Socialists swept in those 3. They also won a few other primaries and seats around the country. There's another big wave of them coming up in other jurisdictions and other states next week. And for the next few weeks, but the AOCs and the Mamdanis and the new radical face of the Democratic Party is more and more becoming victorious. There's just no way around it. And Schumer is terrified that AOC is going to challenge him in the primary in 2028 in New York and wipe him out, and she probably would. Maybe she'll run for president. There's a whole bunch of maybes, but the old liberal D's are just getting pounded by the really radical young socialists, and they're getting pounded in the Democratic primary. That does not bode well for Democrats in November. They'll overperform, but nothing like what they would traditionally get in this historical environment. Okay, folks, we've got to move on. Let's move to seeing session. This is, we're 6 months out from the legislative session, but we ought to be talking about it because this is the time where people are formulating opinions, actions. The leaders of the Senate, the leaders of the House, the governor are talking and saying, okay, what do we think we can really pass? Because they're largely in control. So I'm going to make some predictions, and we'll see. We'll just have to grade the paper at the end of session, see if I was right or wrong. All right, folks, if you're just joining us, this is Anthony Holm, host of Politics with the Big Dogs. Make sure you're following us on politicswiththebigdogs.com. Sign up for our newsletter once a week, short little newsletter, in the know. Also, all of these radio shows are converted to podcasts. In fact, there's usually much more content in the podcast. They're on every place you'd expect to find them: Spotify, Apple, YouTube. go listen, and engage. Let's fight for liberty and advance justice. Okay, guys. So it sounds crazy, but it's not. People who are students of the Texas legislature, which I consider myself one, know that bills are being drafted. In fact, they're being circulated now, even though they won't be filed for some time. Powerful groups are meeting with legislative leaders and activists and coalitions to say, hey, we're going to try to pass this bill into law. What do you think? Will you be with us? What can we do? They're negotiating deals. Many folks are, the casinos, for example, are like, okay, here's the type of bill we want to bring. And they're having those discussions now because they're holding leverage over the November elections. You say you need money, and we're willing to fund if we believe that our issue can be passed into law. So I'm going to take some stabs at looking ahead and seeing what occurs in the legislature and what doesn't. Number one, casinos. I'm going to say a bill hits the floor of the Texas House to allow predatory gambling in Texas. And it won't obviously allow on its face casinos to be built, because that can't be. You have to have a vote of the people and change the Texas Constitution, because gambling is illegal constitutionally. So what's that require? It requires 100 votes in the Texas House, and all of these Republicans who support it, it'll be a coalition of primarily Democrats and probably plus 6 more Democrats, right? I think 6 or maybe even 7 will get elected in the Texas House, and they'll all swear allegiance to the casinos. And then a bunch of Republicans who will join them. Basically, it's the coalition that elected now Speaker Burrows in last session, right? Primarily Democrats with this group of 20 or so Republicans. Now, this is not a poke at the Burrows coalition, because Burrows is going to be reelected, I believe, by the vast majority of Republicans, and probably even all of them. Wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But what does this mean? So now we have a floor vote to allow a constitutional amendment in the Texas House for predatory gambling, full-on casinos in Texas. And it will be a bunch of Democrats saying, oh, it's an economic engine, we should have these, we can fund schools, we can do all these things, boom, boom. You know, the same scam they gave us about the Texas lottery, which we've addressed on previous shows. You can go and find them again on Spotify and Apple and and YouTube, where these live. But the Republicans will turn around and say, you know, I'm not for casinos and I'm going to campaign against it, but I'm for the people's right to vote. Just this, you know, tongue-in-cheek type nonsensical cop-out. Either you believe in a policy or you don't. And I think, I'm going to say it today, I think it's going to be on the House floor. I don't know if it passes, but I think it gets a material chunk of votes. And I'll do some version of Republicans' talking point, which I oppose it, but the people deserve the right to vote. And I'm going to campaign against it. So what's this remind us of? It reminds me, you know, of the DEI. Oh, I'm opposed to DEI, but we're going to embed it every year in the budget. Right? All these people who supposedly oppose something, but magically it just happens anyway. They don't know how in Texas. This is political doublespeak and cowardice by these elected officials, right? And part of the reason that the institutional donors have kept all these rhinos in, so they can get votes like this. I think the other big battle that we're going to have, it should win, but it's going to be a real battle, is the school choice effort. And here's what I mean by that. You and I and Governor Abbott, he led on the issue, right? School choice died, 5 years ago, and then these wave elections occurred in part with Abbott and others leading them, and a whole bunch of incumbents went down who opposed school choice, and then we got it embedded. Well, it was kind of a scam. I'm glad we have it, but you know, it sure wasn't much. And when I say a scam, it was a school choice program. There's no doubt about that. It's not a fraudulent program, but here's the policy behind it in a nutshell. Basically, the Republican leadership said, hey, you school, you know, educrats, who are all the Democrats plus many of the Republicans, many of them are just pro-government schools, top to bottom, even though it doesn't matter that they're crappy, doesn't matter about anything else. And in fact, they're not really even for the kids or the schools themselves. They're for the adults in the system, the teachers and the administrators who I have real issues with, because some of the lowest performing individuals tend to go to them and they don't care about outcomes. But nonetheless, here's what happened. They said, hey, all you educrats, we're going to bake in perpetuity into the Texas budget about a $7 billion increase in spending. So you get $7 billion that you get to go and reallocate, and we're going to index it to inflation and all these cost growths, and no one can go and change it. So found money in perpetuity. And what we're going to do is we're going to take $1 billion in taxpayer money, and we're going to put it into a temporary school choice program. And it's not baked into the budget. It's every 2 years. So $1 billion is a lot of money, but it's going to serve, about 70,000 students. We have like 5.6 million public school kids. So we're talking about 1.5% of our children. And guess what, Democrats and educrat Republicans and government school Republicans, you can kill the program by not funding it in 2 years. And then these legislative leaders said, yeah, it's a 2-year appropriation, but we're not even going to take that money out for the first year. We're only going to do it in the second school year. So what they school choice advocates are banking on, no pun intended, is that, 65,000 or so school choice recipient families will all come and lobby the Texas legislature. Don't kill this. Don't kill this. Refund or reappropriate that $1 billion. Every 2 years, people who believe in school choice have to come to the Texas legislature and beg for a continued appropriation, because I was about to say because they didn't have the courage to bake it into the system. But that's not the truth. The truth is they did it by design, because they only begrudgingly allowed school choice as a policy, and they wanted to make sure that they could easily and quietly kill it without their fingerprints. And if not kill it, they'll just reduce the funding. So here's what we've not heard. We've not heard Governor Abbott come out and say, if this doesn't get appropriated at least $1 billion, I'm going to veto the budget and call them back. We've heard silence on all of this. And by the way, it's not just the Texas House. We've just got to be honest about it. I fervently believe, and I'm a pretty good gauge and a pretty good head count, that the Texas House was more forward-thinking on school choice than the Texas Senate. The Texas Senate almost couldn't pass school choice. And a big part of how it got pared down was the Republicans in the Senate. No way around it. Charles Perry is a great example. Here's a very strong conservative, a man of faith, a guy who was in the Texas House that took out a rhino long-term moderate in Lubbock. Then Charles Perry went on to become the state senator from Lubbock. But he was not and is not an aggressive school choice advocate. In fact, quite the opposite. Part of the limitations, rather, of the program of school choice was a function of Dan Patrick's Senate. Traditionally, we have all for years watched the Senate outperform the House, but that was not the case on school choice, in my very strong opinion. And I've been a school choice advocate and steeped in these policies for a long time, many, many years. I'm open to being wrong, of course, but I had pretty good insight, and I believe it was the Senate that actually held it back, both in its scale and the fact that it was baked in when it occurred, and the dollar appropriated. So, again, you and I and people who thought we had eradicated DEI and proven wrong, and thought we had embedded school choice and now proven wrong, we're going to be at the mercy of these legislators and begging them to reappropriate at least $1 billion. If not more, they ought to index it to inflation. It's going to be a real fight. And when the budget is tight, this is where they'll cut. That assumes it even gets reappropriated. And then the other thing that's going to happen is the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying will die. It won't be passed. I'm going to make that prediction now. And it may pass the Senate in a real weak, moderated form, because much like school choice, the Senate also is not as strong as you'd expect on a full ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying. The legislators like all their little friends in that lobby community to take them dinner and are in their ears and take them to Spurs games and drink with them and do all these things. And they want their school boards to have taxpayer-funded money to hire new lobbyists who then spend money to take them out and about and do things for them. So it might pass the Senate. in a pared down form. It will die in the House, both because of leadership's intention and the excuse will be, and it's a fair statement, that there's going to be 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 more Democrats in the Texas House, and the numbers, quote unquote, aren't there. I think we'll have about 80 to 82 Republicans in the Texas House, and the rest will be Ds, right? So that could be a thing. It could be a 70 to 80 or 68 Ds and 82 Rs. Well, you got to get to 76, and you got to take the speaker out of that because he has the right to vote but almost never votes. So that's a Republican vote that is down, and you got to get to 76. So it means that you can't lose more than 5 or 6 Republicans, depending on exactly what their number is, unless you have at least a couple Democrats. So things get tough and tight. And the banning of taxpayer-funded lobbying, even though it's a legislative priority and a high priority by the Republican Party of Texas, I'm going to suggest is going to be a struggle, if not doomed already, primarily because of the House, but also because of the Senate. They don't necessarily like it. I think you and I are going to have to fight to ensure at least $1 billion gets continued to be appropriated into school choice, and we'll probably have to make a bunch of trades. We're going to, not we, but the Republican leadership in the Texas House and the Texas Senate, but primarily the House on this one, will sell out things like the DEI program and other fundamental policies that you and I oppose under the guise of needing, we have to make a trade so we can get that other $1 billion for school choice. All because they didn't have the Constitution, and by that I mean not the document, but the inner force and the resolute and the character to say, hey, educrats and rhinos, we're going to give you $7 billion baked in perpetuity for government schools. We're also going to bake in $1 billion. Nope, couldn't do that. Made it as a standalone appropriation. So now you and I and TPPF and people who believe the way we do have to go and fight and beg and cajole and be happy that they appropriate $800 million instead of $600 million, even though it's a cut. A whole bunch of weight and risk is being put on the ability to mobilize those 60,000 or so families who have yet to participate in school choice, but in theory will start participating in the middle of August to early September, and mobilize all of those families by February. That's a big ask on political outcomes, so I'm making my call in the here and now. These are the struggles, and these are at least 3 of the items that will headline the legislative docket and the fights coming up next session. So we'll see. Look, I'd love to be wrong on a couple of them. I'd really like that, and I'll be the first one to come back and say, hallelujah, I was wrong. But this is my prognostication for the moment, and I bet it comes out in some way, shape, or form pretty similar. All right, guys, we've got to move on to a new topic. We've gone through a number of items, Texas focus. Let's touch on the United States Senate. 4 Republicans joined this week with all the Democrats to neuter President Trump. And why do I say that? I'm using this word deliberately because President Trump and our military forces went and largely handled Iran, really had them in a vulnerable position. Iran, which has been a death to America regime my entire life, well, since 78, almost my entire life, took hostages, stormed the embassy. Those of you who don't remember it, I remember it vividly. I was a child, and every night the news, it ran the pictures of the hostages and those big wide blindfolds and didn't light the Christmas tree. It was over a year that they were held. Well, they stormed the embassy, and movies have been made about it. Maybe you saw a movie, but Iran's been probably the greatest funder and advocate of terrorism against America and Israel, but certainly America over the last 30 years, directly responsible for hundreds of Americans' deaths. And I got to give kudos to President Trump, who largely went and just killed most of their leadership and put them totally at their mercy. The planes could fly at will. All of their surface-to-air missiles were handled, just taken out. We had absolute control of the skies. And then he did get a little bit timid. He had them down. He had his foot in the throat and got, I believe, afraid of the stock market and the price of oil and surrendered a bit. I would have liked to seen him go farther and just keep a juggernaut on him, but he made a reasonable choice. I'm not going to be too critical of it. I've got to give him praise for doing what nobody had the courage to do in the last 30 years. And then he said, okay, Iran, we'll do a ceasefire and we'll negotiate for the next 60 days or so, but you're not going to have a nuclear program and you're going to do A, B, and C, right? And Iran didn't agree to it, but he outlined it, and he basically kept the environment like, hey, I can just blow up every bridge. I can go and blow up your entire oil infrastructure. We have you at our mercy. Well, the Democrats in the U.S. Senate and 4 Rhino Republicans joined the Democrats to say, we're going to pass a resolution, we're going to pass a bill to put constraints on President Trump's ability to go and attack Iran again. So I'm just so struck and outraged that the U.S. Senate would say, hey, Mr. President, effectively we didn't like you going and declaring war without an act of Congress. I get that. There's a fair policy debate about it and constitutional powers debate. It has occurred. America has largely won, and now the President of the United States is negotiating terms with a rogue nation who funds terrorism and is on the cusp of getting a nuclear bomb. And the U.S. Senate, with the aid of 4 Republicans, said, yeah, but we're going to limit your ability to attack them again, while the president is actively negotiating. So what's it do? Obviously, it empowers Iran. They say, we don't have to give as much because you can't come and do this again. That's almost treason. I'm so bothered by this. People are so anti-Trump. And look, the guy has some warts. There's no way around it, but I sure honor so many of the policy outcomes. But this is treasonous. Wait until the negotiating is done and America gets the best deal it possibly can. Trump is negotiating for America. They, the Democrat Senate and the 4 moderate R's, along with a whole bunch of other moderate R's, no doubt Cornyn being one of them. They called his defeat Liberation Day. He gets to now go be his true self, even though they tried to feed us this line of bull. These people are harming America. They're just so radar focused on trying to embarrass Trump. It's one thing to attack somebody personally, but you're attacking our nation, the strength of our nation. As the President of the United States, who happens to be named Trump, is negotiating basically a surrender of the terrorist state. Oh no, we're going to limit your ability to attack them again. Well, that empowers the terrorist state of Iran, and they know they don't have to give as much. This is treason. Suddenly all these people like Cornyn, who's a nice enough fellow, but he's been there so long, he hasn't done anything. He didn't ever tame Iran. He didn't even pass voter ID. I mean, it's just shocking. So now they're calling it Liberation Day. Ha, ha, ha. We get to show you, Mr. Trump, we can beat you. We're the Senate. Wow. These are acts of treason. There's just no way around it. This is happening up and down the Republican ticket, not just in the Senate, not just Cornyn. It's the same thing that we're talking about at the House. The Texas House is the same thing with school choice. It's the same thing with DEI. It's the same thing with Texas A&M. It's the same thing with the Texas Senate. All of these people are talking a good game, but Cornyn's the brightest line example. Cornyn, before his defeat by Paxton in the runoff, was, oh, Trump this and Trump that. I'm all in. Let's break the filibuster in the U.S. Senate. Oh, I lost by 30 points because I've been rejected by real conservatives in Texas who have watched me for 30 years. Well, then it's my Liberation Day, and we're not doing any of that. And the filibuster is awesome, and we don't need voter ID because you don't have the votes. Well, wait a second. What do you mean we don't have the votes? We have a majority of the U.S. Senate, and it's passed the U.S. House, even though there's a super tight majority over there. How come we can't pass it? Oh, well, we got to honor the Democrats. We've got to let them filibuster. They're going to filibuster voter ID, which I just assumed was a federal mandate already, and it's not. It's an 80-20 issue. Let them do it. Let them filibuster it. Let's see what happens. I think they'll collapse. You've got at least one Democratic senator who said he'd vote for it because Pennsylvanians recognize that it makes sense. This is what's happening top to bottom among our elected officials. Certainly among the Republicans, maybe the Democrats as well, but it's clearly happening among the Republicans. Those are the ones we study, you and I study, and why we're fighting for liberty. They tell us, oh no, I totally oppose DEI. Yet they embed it in the budget. They appoint people, the Texas A&M, this bastion of conservatism, who then lifts up DEI professors and gives them tenure so they can't be fired. They say, oh, yeah, I want to ban taxpayer-funded lobbying, but they just don't get to it. I can't do it because the Democrats, they won't vote for it. Well, wait a second. You have a majority of Republicans. Yeah, but that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really count. The fact is, almost zero policy outcomes really occur by these folks. You and I get outraged. They do a few things to basically throw us off their scent, and then very limited policy outcomes. Oh, okay, you defeated 20 of our incumbents. We'll pass school choice, but we won't fund it more than the next 2 years, and the Democrats and the moderate R's can go ahead and defund it. Oh, and we'll pass school choice, but we're really going to limit it because even the Republicans in the Senate don't really support it. Look, political outcomes, these races, so often have policy outcome. And Ken Paxton, who I voted for and advocate for, certainly had plenty of personal warts and failings, often like Trump, right, in my opinion. But both of them advance policy outcomes with bravery, and their fundamental conservative policies, like pure market policies, even when they're speaking in the face of power. And I honor that so much. We've had state reps in Texas who have done it. We've had some state senators as well. But more often than not, they collapse into it. You know, Paxton did it when he was in there. We've had others I could name. But the bulk of them do not. And that's what you and I are fighting for, to advance liberty and real freedom in America, and making sure our elected officials who are in there to move policy, not just in there to say they're Republican. That's the KBH, Bush, Karl Rove model. We're going to elect the most moderate person to have the best chance of winning in November, and it's not driven by policy outcomes. Oh, and by the way, now we're going to attack all the conservative policies, saying it's too extreme, you shouldn't elect them. Well, guess what? We did elect them, and we're winning. So hallelujah. All right, folks, so we touched on this a little bit. We've talked about the fraud in Minnesota many times on this show, and all of us have seen it, national news. Of course, our mainstream media didn't want to cover it, but you and I made sure, and it was just so conspicuous and abusive and fraudulent, and particularly when you had migrants working together, setting up these daycare centers that nobody ever attended, and they were getting block grants from the feds and block grants from the state. It had clearly been known forever and a day, but they didn't want to, they wanted those folks to stay, keep voting for the Democrats. They also didn't want to be accused of racism. Kudos to the DOJ and to the citizen activists who go out there with a video camera and prove it and show them driving, $100,000 cars and no children in the daycare, and all run by Somalis and Congans and everybody else. So the DOJ took it a step farther. The Trump Justice Department, and you've known there's fraud everywhere. I've known there's fraud. It just is. When you have $1 trillion in government programs, so-called health care, there's going to be fraud. So most recent, most conspicuous was a few days ago, the Justice Department unveiled a series of allegations and prosecutions, began prosecuting 450 individual defendants for health care fraud in excess of $6.5 billion with a B. 1 billion is 1,000 million. So 100,000 million, like just shocking amounts of dollars. Your tax dollars, my tax dollars, hoovered up. So 90 plus medical professionals are targets, all sorts of fraud, Medicare fraud, Medicaid fraud, you name it. And the ones that jumped out at me were like the hospice programs. So it turns out that the federal government, through block grants, I believe, that come down, Medicare, Medicaid, and they fund tremendous hospice care. Hospice care, of course, is where people who are terminally ill often spend their last days, weeks, sometimes even months and years. The goal, as I understand it, in hospice is to live as pain-free as you can. So one owner, Orrin David Shakar, the indictment says that he misrepresented hospice program and says, hey, we're going to improve your quality of life. You're sick. You're not. These folks weren't dying. They seem to be sick. But rather than into life care, it said, no, we're going to help you. We're going to improve it. You're struggling, you're in a wheelchair, you're this and that. Don't worry about it. Move into my center. I'll pay you up to $400 a month in cash. I'll give you groceries. I'll buy alcohol for you. We'll provide televisions, furniture, everything you need. Just stay here, stay here, stay here. Oh, and if you refer some of your friends in here, then I'll give you a cash bonus too. Because it was so lucrative by each head count to have in hospice that he was inducing people and able to pay them $400 a month and buy them alcohol for people who are just sick or just existing, but were not in end-of-life care. So 450 people are being criminally prosecuted in over 40 states and like over 50 or 60 different federal courts. It's just crazy. 41 different states allowed Medicaid and Medicare fraud. Holy smokes. And I'm sure this is the tip of the iceberg. 90 plus medical professionals colluding to ensure people like the Somalis in Minnesota make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars by appropriating our tax dollars under fraudulent government services that no doubt, when you have a fraud of this scale, no doubt people in state and federal government are acutely aware of this abuse and this fraud, and they're choosing not to do anything about it. When the scale of abuse is this large and widespread corruption, they just bake it in. And somebody or many, many legions of people's jobs in federal and state government depend on these programs. And if they made national or international news, those programs might end. So often Americans think job is a right instead of a privilege. That, no, this is just how it is. It's taxpayer fraud and abuse. Well, that's how you become Colombia or Mexico or these places that are rampant with fraud. And that's how we go bankrupt as a nation, which we are, right? We just are. We're going bankrupt as a nation in large part because of these socialist programs and the gross fraud. I'm all for taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. I think we all are. That's human. It's human nature. Whether we do it through our churches and charitable organizations or we do it through our government is a policy debate. But I suspect everybody engaged in this program and this podcast believes that we have a duty and a desire to take care of folks who can't take care of themselves, including terminally ill who have needs. No issue with that. But baking in so much money that operators of these so-called hospice facilities are financially incentivized to pay people $400 a month to stay there, buy them groceries, buy them alcohol, give them referrals. Clearly, there's a tremendous amount of waste, and we're overpaying for these services. Bottom line is government is just incredibly inefficient and shouldn't be in this many businesses. We should pare down government and let the private sector and the free market go in advance and be incredibly efficient. And additionally, the other part of the bottom line is whenever you have a government program and humans engage in a bureaucracy that wants to perpetuate itself, it will be wrought with fraud. I got to give tremendous kudos to President Trump and the Trump DOJ for having the courage to look and bring a claim. Because every DOJ who every Department of Justice and every president and every individual staffing these folks and the DOJ over the last 30 years has been able to find this fraud. Either they found it and they've remained quiet, or they've taken great pains not to see it so they didn't have to deal with it. So again, more and more fraud and waste in government programs and just further argument against a socialist perspective where government controls all. We need a streamlined government, bring down the size, engage the private sector, bring in charitable institutions and people who can deliver efficiently and without fraud. All right. Next topic, guys, we've at least got to give a wave at this because it's strong. It's just so strong. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 8-1 against a religious effort by a prisoner in the state of Louisiana. So a prisoner in the state of Louisiana, it turns out Louisiana has a law or at least a regulation where prisoners have to have reasonably short hair. You can't grow dreadlocks or big ponytails and things. It's got to be trimmed. It's how it is. Well, a fella who had dreadlocks said, well, my faith is I'm a Rastafarian, and Rastafarians smoke marijuana as part of their faith, as I understand it, and grow dreadlocks. So I'm sure there's other aspects, but those are the two that I understand to be most conspicuous about the faith. I don't know if they let him smoke in prison. I suspect no, but he claimed, hey, my dreadlocks are part of my religious beliefs and affiliation. You can't cut them. And when the guards forcibly trimmed his hair to comply with the laws and the regulations, what did he do? A guy who violated somebody's civil rights so much that he's a criminal and institutionalized, what did he do? He sued. Of course, sued individually the guards, so they cut my hair against my religious belief. Well, 8-1, so at least 2 of the 3 radical Democrats who were appointed by Biden and Obama to the U.S. Supreme Court, they even sided with the rational conservatives and saying, nope, if you're a criminal, you're a prisoner, you don't get a right to grow your hair long. You're there in part because you so thoroughly violated the civil rights of another citizen who has the opportunity to walk freely in the U.S., and you have foregone your opportunity to walk freely in the U.S., so your hair is going to be trimmed. My dumbed down version, but effectively that's where it is. And so hallelujah, some reason and some sanity from the U.S. Supreme Court, and that which has become much more rational and sane in the last, well, frankly, because of Trump. You know, John Roberts led it, but he was a Bush moderate who wouldn't ban, who found a way to inappropriately keep Obamacare alive, right? And the Obama tax, not a tax, but is a tax, inappropriately keep race-based quotas alive until Trump brought real conservatives on there, and they had a strong majority, and then Roberts, found the light suddenly. Go figure. So, again, the U.S. Supreme Court and Trump's courage to appoint good constitutional conservatives to it are materially changing and impacting policy in America. Like, politics impacts policy, and I've got to be appreciative of it. So, a quick wave of at the Rastafarian effort by the prisoner in Louisiana, and this is a good time to recognize Tepper Time, named after Carl Tepper, the moderate, get-along Republican state rep out of Lubbock, who has complained that the listeners don't always know that I'm a lawyer, a trial lawyer, and go to court. Yes, of course, I'm a trial lawyer and go to court, and it's one of the reasons that I flag so many issues like this when the U.S. Supreme Court acts, right? I'm reasonably steeped in the law and A-OK reading an opinion, processing it, and regurgitating it on the air, or at least giving a thumbnail where it's interesting and otherwise. So, all right, Carl Tepper, there is your Tepper Time disclaimer for this show. We're about out of time, so let me just do it in a quick thumbnail, but we've got to give this topic some real time on another show. It's tragic. It's pretty much another day, and it's another Texas teacher who is convicted of sexually assaulting a student or student. We have an epidemic in Texas, but it's been an epidemic. It's just finally being exposed. Teachers every single week are being prosecuted and convicted for violating students, for grooming students. The one that I saw most recently was a fellow who had been teaching middle schoolers for like 30 years. And on the eve of trial where he was going to be prosecuted, he cut a deal and said, okay, I'm going to settle, I'm going to accept guilt, for these 5 different lesser crimes to avoid jail time and to try to avoid having to register as on a sexual predators list. And this one succeeded. This is happening. It's just a rampant problem. And it's one of the values, frankly, and the upsides of making sure that we have lawsuits in Texas and then we have civil practice rights, because these students and these parents can go and sue that teacher in that school district, and they should, because this has been illegal conduct for decades, yet it's rampant everywhere. So school districts and principals it's very evident that they pass these teachers around, just move them on. They don't want to be exposed. The average term of a superintendent is 3 years. They keep trying to move up to the next school district, make more money. And these are black marks, so they tend to hush up concerns and claims and not give parents a ton of information and just move the teacher to a different jurisdiction. And it all continues, and we have these embedded sexual predators. These have been crimes for decades, but all of these kids continue to be abused. So Representative Mitch Little, who was a freshman rep, he was on the show some months ago. He was the first one to be able to overcome Texans for Lawsuit Reform, which just has stifled any expansion of lawsuits in Texas. He overcame last session. It was so impressive, and he defeated them. And he eroded some of the sovereign immunity protections of the school districts who are protecting pedophiles, right? When you're hiring a teacher or an administrator who's known or should be known pedophile, that family should be able to sue the school district. But there's been this notion of sovereign immunity. The school district can't be sued. And Mitch Little was able to make a little tiny change to help defend some of these kids. And he got to do it by saying, look, for 30, 40, 50 years, this have been crimes and the criminal statutes aren't working. We've got to put the power of the purse to work and allow people to go and sue the school district so the school districts will pay attention and take this seriously. It's the first time I've seen TLR defeated and allow an expansion of lawsuits in Texas that, frankly, that I can remember. And I know they didn't want to, but it was real tough to argue against this when so many school children are violated and harmed by the teachers every single day and every single week. It's just heartbreaking. So another week, another effort, another conviction and prosecution. But again, this guy got off lightly, in large part because it's so emotionally traumatic for these students to show up and have to talk about, a 12-year-old having to talk about the 40-year-old teacher who violated them and have a defense attorney cross-examine them. Well, have you ever done this? Have you ever done that? Have you ever been sexually active? Have you ever smoked marijuana? To a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old and try to make them look like they're the ones who are at fault and not the teachers. So Mitch Littles and all of the people advocating for the students of Texas, thank you. And we'll get there one way or another. If we have to do a free market approach to allow lawsuits top to bottom to end this type of predatory sexual behavior in the schools, then I'm for it, because this is fundamentally wrong and our children deserve better. We should prosecute all of these adults for violating our kids. There have been hundreds in the last 2 years, hundreds. And at some point we'll dedicate an episode or a big segment to them, and we'll just line item. It's really tragic. It's so hurtful. There have been loads of legislative testimony by adults coming back. You don't understand. In Kerrville, Texas, I was violated by this teacher, dozens and dozens of times when I was in the 8th grade, the 9th grade, the 10th grade, and now I'm a 28-year-old adult or 30-year-old adult. I've personally witnessed this testimony, and over years of counseling and having the strength of being an adult, am I able to sit here and say, you have got to fix what's happening in the schools, folks. You have just got to fix it. It is heart-wrenching testimony, and the children deserve better, and frankly, we as a state and a legislature can do better. We can do that, and we will do better. All right, folks, that's all we can get to. We had so much more, but thank you. Thank you for fighting for freedom. Thank you for ensuring liberty to our state, to our families, to our children. We have won. We are winning. Like-minded people, 1%. We can change the world. If 1% of us speak with a single voice, we will change policy and defend these children and make sure that there is opportunity and liberty for the next generation and generations in Texas. Thank you. Thank you for being an activist for freedom, and God bless Texas.